Thank you very much for that very warm welcome, rather extensive introduction. I hope I will not disappoint. Thank you for the opportunity to address you all today. It's really always a pleasure to be back here at the Academy. Now, I am conscious you've all had an early start and it is rather late in the day, and that I'm the one standing between you and dinner. So I will try not to make this too long. Earlier today, I spoke about 10 trends that shape the biosecurity landscape post-COVID-19. And this evening, I'd like to go into a little bit more depth about one of those trends, namely disinformation and battles of influence. So Russian allegations of biological weapon activities in Ukrainian labs, supported by the United States and other countries, have been the centerpiece of Russia's domestic and international disinformation campaign to justify its illegal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Russia has attempted to portray peaceful research on endemic diseases and disease vectors that pose public health threats to the Ukrainian population as being nefarious or malicious. There is, however, no evidentiary basis to suggest that Ukraine's biological activities support anything other than peaceful purposes. Ukraine carries out biological research for legitimate public health and veterinary health purposes. Ukraine does so transparently and in full compliance with its legal obligations under the BWC, the Biological Weapons Convention. And international support for biological research in Ukraine is no secret. Ukraine, with the US and other countries providing support to biological research in Ukraine, are transparent about their activities. They annually declare their activities under the biological weapons confidence-building measures, and they voluntarily share this information publicly. This contrasts sharply with Russia, which appears to actively withhold its own BWC-relevant research activities from public scrutiny. The Russian allegations have been exposed as baseless by the UN Secretary-General's High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, by members of the UN Security Council, and by the G7. Independent analysts, including Russian scientists, have also debunked the Russian allegations and have highlighted the damaging effects that disinformation has on disarmament efforts and on international cooperation to strengthen biosurveillance, biosafety, and biosecurity. In this presentation, I will put the current disinformation campaign in a larger historical frame, giving examples of earlier disinformation campaigns where we see variations on the current claims. I will highlight a few aspects that are different about the current campaign. And what is clear is that these battles for influence will only increase in future. And in conclusion, I will consider what it'll take for democratic societies to respond to them. So with those preliminaries out of the way, let's dig into some of the historical details. So Russian allegations tie into a long history of false claims and active measures stretching back to the early years of the Cold War. Since the 1950s, the Soviet Union maintained an ongoing campaign alleging biological weapon use by the United States. These false allegations have often involved communist allies like North Korea, China, Cuba, and Eastern European states. And they've often, interestingly, involved labs. One campaign in the early 1980s alleged that a lab in Lahore, in the Pakistan Malaria Research Center, was not a University of Maryland lab researching malaria, but a CIA-funded lab to breed weaponized mosquitoes. The poisoners from overseas who worked there were plotting to infect entire cattle herds with viruses and then take advantage of the seasonal migration of the herds from Pakistan to Afghanistan to start an epidemic there. Now, that story came out about a year after the UN General Assembly had passed a resolution establishing the UN Secretary-General's mechanism for investigating chemical and biological weapon use. This resulted from concerns the US had raised about Soviet use of chemical weapons in Southeast Asia, especially in Laos and Afghanistan, where the Afghan Mujahideen acted as American proxies. By early 1982, the US government was making more and more evidence about Soviet chemical weapon use in Afghanistan available to the UN and to the wider public, and the Soviet disinformation campaign was an effort to throw doubt on the American evidence. A second lab-related campaign that started shortly after the weaponized mosquito campaign, and that I think most of you will be familiar with already, is the story that AIDS was an American biological weapon developed in the labs at Fort Detrick. There are still conspiracy theories floating around about HIV and bioweapons, and every time I ask my students if they've heard of this, more than half the class will raise their hand and say, yes, we've heard that AIDS is from an American lab. A more recent disinformation campaign alleges that the Pentagon is establishing a chain of biological weapons labs on Russia's border, and that the main focus of the accusation has been the Lugar Center for Public Health Research in Georgia. The chain of labs campaign has been simmering for several years, but it was really following the attempted assassination of Sergei Skripal with Novichok in the UK that this campaign ramped up. Over a few months in late 2018, I traced and became involved in the intensifying multi-channel disinformation attack that was unfolding. And I'd like to take just a few minutes to tell that story because I think it's quite instructive in terms of how we understand what's happening today in terms of the disinformation campaign that we're seeing. So by way of background, the Richard Lugar Center was established in 2011 and became operational in 2013, and Russian allegations about these labs were present from the very beginning. Once the British counter-terrorist police issued arrest warrants for Russian GRU agents for the Novichok attack, that disinformation campaign started ramping up in early September. We quickly saw that a former Georgian state security minister, Giorgadze, launched a campaign against the Lugar Center, heavily publicized in Russian media. And he did that through a press conference where he claimed he had access to thousands of pages of secret documents indicating that US Department of Defense biologists were engaged in illegal medical experiments on the Georgian people, and that facility could be a cover for a biological weapons lab. He also wrote an open letter which saying, you know, we need to look at all of this documentation that I have unearthed. US Congress should be investigating this, and so on. He then created this website and uploaded an initial batch of documents to support his allegations, claiming that further documents would be forthcoming. And here's just an example of some of the media coverage from Russia. RT, as you will all know, is a Russian government outlet of information. So just within a day, so the following day, a Bulgarian investigative journalist published an article that seems to kind of corroborate what Giorgadze was saying. That also gets picked up in Russian newspapers, TV, and other media. We then see the Russian Ministry of Defense claiming that the Lugar Center is violating the Biological Weapons Convention. It doesn't do this at the Biological Weapons Convention or to members of the Biological Weapons Convention. It's merely making these claims to the media. A week later, Georgia responds to these claims in this diplomatic note verbal, basically a memo that you send to other missions, that were sent to other missions in Geneva, all members of the Biological Weapons Convention, and this is what that note verbal looked like, basically saying, you know, there's nothing to these claims. Quickly thereafter, the head of the Russian Special Forces for Nuclear, Biological and Chemical Protection claimed that the Lugar Lab is part of this larger US effort to build up its military biological potential, which we've all become fairly familiar with at this stage, or at least that narrative. On the same day, the chair of the Russian Parliament's Committee on Defense threatens that Russia will take diplomatic and military measures. And Russia then also issues a note verbal to Geneva missions where they say, you know, Georgia's got this all wrong, we were right all along, there is dodgy stuff going on, and they need to explain themselves. Already, I should say, at this point, Georgia has already announced that it will invite foreign experts to its lab to see its facilities, to speak with its scientists in a peer review exercise or a peer review visit. Russia addresses this head-on, saying, in that last paragraph there, you'll see, oh, that's just creating an illusion of legitimacy and transparency, and Russia doesn't see any value and will certainly not participate. But Russia was invited to participate, but they chose not to. The debate continues at the UN General Assembly. Syria is accusing Georgia here, coming to Russia's aid, of hosting secret labs. Both Syria and Russia make references to this chain of bioweapons labs throughout the entire 4-week meeting. Georgia addresses these allegations again. Here's a prepared statement. I don't need to go into all the details. There's a right of reply from the Russian delegation, and here they are, you know, saying again, no, they're doing all kinds of really dodgy stuff. In a right of reply to the right of reply, there's a lot of back and forth, a lot of ping-ponging between diplomats here about what is actually happening in these labs. And then there is time for this peer review visit. There was a quick pre-meet on the 13th of November where the international group, where I was one of the experts invited along, not as a government expert, but as the one independent expert that could speak to media and could give information out about the visit that others could not. And so we had the first day of the visit was the 14th of November. We had briefings in the morning and then a tour of the facility and the labs where we were allowed to speak to people. So this is the opening briefing. Georgia was supported by the German Minister of Defense and Minister of Foreign Affairs. There were also Austrian representatives at the meeting. Here you see some of us. As I said, I was the only one who could speak to the media, and there was a lot of media interest, particularly from Russia. Here's our the group and the local staff at the Lugar Center for Public Health. Here we're going through files that we were provided with, more media, and here you see us in some of the BSL-2 facilities, looking through, really going through every single room in the building. The Center for Disease Control, of course, was trying to combat this disinformation campaign and was trying to be as open as possible, posting a lot of this on Twitter, on its website, and so on. I was on 3 different Georgian channels that evening, talking about what we were doing. And the following day, we then saw their high containment facility, the BSL-3 lab, a larger site tour, and then drafted our concluding report that afternoon. So here you see us looking in outhouses and outbuildings. They opened every door to us that we wanted. We were on the roof of the building. We were in the basement of the building. We could ask questions of security guards, of scientists, of technicians, of anyone. This is, finally, we've completed the tour. And this is the report that we came up with after about 3 hours of negotiation. And our concluding sentence said, the facility demonstrated significant transparency about its activities. The visiting team observed nothing that was inconsistent with prophylactic, protective, and other peaceful purposes. These are the words of the Biological Weapons Convention, essentially saying that countries should not be doing anything that is in contravention, that is not consistent with prophylactic, protective, and other peaceful purposes, and that's why that particular wording was used. It was not the rubber stamp approval that the Georgians would have wanted. They wanted us to say this facility does not have any biological weapons and does not conduct any biological weapons research, but we are not able to say that. All we can really say is we've not seen anything that's out of the ordinary. And so I think in the end we were true to what we were able to say, and it was enough for them, even though it was they would have wished for slightly more. I wrote up the study and published very quickly the results of our trip and the whole disinformation campaign, how that had unfolded. The Georgians, along with the rest of the countries represented on the tour, wrote up a working paper to the Biological Weapons Convention, so a formal documentation to the UN treaty that was entered into the formal documentation. That we then held a side event on the visit, so in the margins of the Biological Weapons Convention meeting, and it was hosted by both Germany and Georgia, with the German, Georgian, and French ambassadors all present. Here you see us up there again. I was on that podium explaining more from an independent perspective what was going on, but also the Georgians were there from the Luker lab as well, explaining what they had, their perspective. And then the second working paper was produced that I wrote, which was my own independent report. And again, that went into the formal record of... Sorry, I'm having issues with the slides here. There we go. Okay. That went into the formal UN record. So following those discussions at the BWC, and it was a side event in one of those typical UN rooms where delegations are spread throughout, including an absolute wall of Russian delegation members. Everyone else was sort of everywhere else, but there was a wall of about 10 Russian delegation members, and we were fairly worried how this would go, but it went fine. There had been a lot of back-channel negotiations about how this was going to play out, and everyone more or less said what they wanted to say, and from then on this campaign more or less died down. But within months, Russia started more actively trying to undermine the UN security, the UN Secretary General's mechanism again. And over the last couple of years, we've seen Russia trying to undermine the mechanism's integrity, its independence, and its impartial character, and attempts to strip away the Secretary General's authority by transferring investigation decisions to the Security Council, where, of course, Russia has a veto. So what they would like is for the Secretary General not to be able to say, if there is a biological weapons attack, or there is some allegation of a deliberate biological incident, they don't want the Secretary General to have the power to say, we need to investigate this. They'd like to say that decision should lie with the Security Council, of course, where they could veto any decision to undergo an investigation. So there is a link between disinformation campaigns and weakening international structures for investigating biological weapons use or alleged use. And I've just put this article up. If you'd like to read more about that, you can do that. What I want to do is move on to some of the conclusions and really what we've learned, because there are, to my mind, at least 3 key differences between those early Soviet disinformation campaigns in the 1980s and Russia's more recent campaigns. And the first of which is the speed with which the information spreads. In the 80s, it took weeks and months for the information to spread globally. Now that disinformation campaigns are live streamed, they're instantaneously shared on social media and picked up rapidly. The second notable difference, I think, is that the practice is no longer to plant items in obscure media outlets abroad. So some of the early campaigns would be planted in, say, an Indian newspaper, eventually would get picked up by more Western outlets. That's not how it's done anymore. Now, some of the more senior officials in the Russian government are delivering the disinformation directly. The third is that international disarmament and security structures are co-opted into the process. So note verbals, Security Council meetings, General Assembly meetings, special sessions of the Security Council, and media briefings at the UN are all used as platforms to spread and to legitimize the disinformation. There's also been some evolution from the Georgia campaign to the Ukraine campaign that we're still witnessing today. While the two campaigns basically say the same thing, so they're talking about American involvement in public health labs and experiments on local populations, and even some of the same mouthpieces are involved. So the Bulgarian investigative journalist, for instance, who I highlighted to you in the Georgia case, she was sort of brought back in the Ukrainian disinformation campaign as an independent expert who could talk authoritatively on, the evidence presented. So there have been a lot of similarities, but there have also been some notable differences, not least of which, obviously, is that we're currently in a hot war. But what we've seen in the Ukraine campaign is that the disinformation has been dedicated the highest political profile. So it's been at the UN, discussed at the UN Security Council. Putin himself has been pushing the campaign forward. But at the same time, there's been some kind of informality in which these allegations have been made that is also striking. So at press briefings, for example, by the permanent representative of Russia to the UN, he would sign off a briefing where he'd presented lots of data with phrases like, well, stay tuned, we'll keep you posted. The kind of language that's trivializing these allegations. And it should be noted that these allegations have not actually been made using the appropriate biological weapons convention mechanisms that are in place to deal with allegations. They've primarily been raised in statements and through media briefings. This time around, the campaign has been substantially supported by far-right conspiracy theorists in the US. So there's been an immediate echo chamber that has meant that the disinformation has spread faster and more widely than before. But perhaps the biggest difference is that China is on board this time round. So in October 2021, Russia and China released for the first time a joint statement by their foreign ministers on strengthening the Biological Weapons Convention. And in it, they did express concern about, American military biological activities overseas, including in Ukraine. And we saw similar sorts of claims made at Biological Weapons Convention meetings. And we saw, just ahead of the Olympic Winter Games in February 2022, we saw both Xi Jinping and Putin releasing an extensive joint statement presenting a vision of a new era of international relations that also then reiterated claims about US overseas bioweapons activities. Now, despite their flagrant falsehoods, despite not being true, Russia's unsupported allegations in Georgia and now Ukraine shouldn't be dismissed as inconsequential because they muddy the waters, they make it harder for non-experts to distinguish between true and false narratives. Disinformation could also further escalate the war in Ukraine, and it creates this perception that the taboo against biological weapons no longer holds. Disinformation is normalizing biological weapons. So disinformation campaigns are built around half-truths. They lend some credibility to an otherwise entirely fabricated and unsubstantiated story. In the biosphere, the disinformation campaign around biological weapons and other threats like the COVID pandemic capitalize on public anxieties about unknown diseases, and they take advantage of existing distrustfulness or wariness about governments, and in particular the US government, to sow confusion, uncertainty, discord, and suspicion. They undermine narratives that suggest Washington and the West more generally are at best incompetent and at worst malevolent. Now, at the same time, there are initiatives to try to push back against this disinformation. So there have been initiatives from the UN, for example. It has a verified initiative, which is trying to increase the volume and the reach of trusted, accurate information sources. So we've got all of that sort of thing going on. This is another report I've written delving more in depth into this topic. So if you want to, in your own time, read more about this, please do. This is my last slide. In the 21st century, it's more true than ever that what matters is who wins the data, the trust and the hearts and the minds of citizens. As George Orwell vividly put it in 1984, power is in tearing human minds to pieces and putting them together again in new shapes of your own choosing. So deliberately propagating false stories is nothing new, but the speed and the reach of contemporary campaigns to shape and influence opinions and actions across the globe is different, and increasingly, what was once propaganda is now being considered as strategic communication. This distinction is important. Disinformation has become a coordinated tool of the state deployed to deliberately sway behavior. Yet, as both the pandemic and the war in Ukraine have highlighted, it is no longer just states that are behind these efforts. The huge efforts are underway by national governments to safeguard the physical and virtual security of its citizenry, but there remains a weakness at the heart of society. This is the frailty of the individual. Increasingly, preserving and enhancing societal resilience will become the most important asset for leaders, and something we've spoken about in earlier strategy conferences here. Empirical case studies will be very important, outlining how these campaigns operate, assessing how to successfully respond to them. More and more education will become key, coupled with trusted sources of information. An educated citizenry capable of critical thinking is best equipped to deal with false stories and rumors. But this education will involve more giving by the state, giving away of secrets. What are the threats? And by extension, revealing some of the level of knowledge about how such knowledge was obtained. It also involves giving of strategies in dealing with threats, and by extension, the current limitations in government policy. And it'll involve more giving of contemporary information more broadly, something that is anathema to intelligence agencies. But until this happens more routinely in other countries, false stories will spread, and those willing or inclined to believe them will find ample reason to support whatever wayward whim they prefer. I thank you so much for your attention. I hope that's given you something to think about. I would also like to thank the translators in the back of the room who have worked very hard all day, and I hope you now have a rest. Thank you so much.